Today, we are going to begin to discuss comparing fractions with unlike denominators by creating equivalent fractions with common denominators. The first step in this process involves finding a common denominator, usually the least common denominator, or LCD. Let's begin by comparing 3/5 and 7/10. The first thing we need to do is look at the denominators, 5 and 10. Our goal is to find a common multiple or common denominator for 5 and 10. The first step is to list the multiples for both 5 and 10. Let's begin with 5. We have 5, 10, 15, 20. Now we'll find the first few multiples of 10. While finding multiples, we can simply skip count. 10, 20, 30, 40. As we examine the multiples, we want to find the smallest number that appears on both lists. In this case, that smallest number is 10. Therefore, the least common denominator for 3/5 and 7/10 is 10. So underneath each fraction, we're going to begin to create equivalent fractions that have a common denominator of 10. This is the first step in comparing fractions with unlike denominators by creating equivalent fractions with common denominators. Let's compare another pair of fractions and determine the least common denominator. 5/6 and 7/9. Let's examine the denominators, 6 and 9. We'll begin by listing the multiples for both 6 and 9. To list the multiples, we can skip count. 6, 12, 18, 24. The multiples of 9 are 9, 18, 27, and 36. As we examine the multiples for both 6 and 9, let's look for the lowest number that appears on each list. We see that number is 18. Therefore, the least common denominator for 5/6 and 7/9 is 18. So underneath our fractions, we're going to begin to create equivalent fractions that have a denominator of 18. Let's take a look at one last example and find the least common denominator for 7/12 and 5/8. We begin by looking at the denominators and listing the multiples for those denominators by skip counting. Let's start with 12. 12, 24, 36, and 48. I always like to start by listing the first 4 multiples for each denominator. The multiples of 8 would be 8, 16, 24, and 32. As we examine each list of multiples, the lowest number that appears on both lists is 24, which is our least common denominator. Now, we'll create equivalent fractions with the denominator of 24. Our next lesson will discuss finding the numerators for these equivalent fractions.